The violent bear it away. In the rural South, a 14-year-old boy named Francis Marion Tarwater has been raised by his great-uncle, Mason Tarwater, a wild old self-proclaimed prophet who believes he's been called by God to make young Francis a prophet too. Mason's world revolves around fiery biblical visions and his conviction that Francis must baptize his cousin, Bishop, a boy with an intellectual disability. When the novel opens, Mason has died at the breakfast table, and young Tarwater is left to bury him, but he doesn't do it right. He gets drunk, sets the cabin on fire, and runs away, trying to escape the destiny his great-uncle forced on him. Francis goes to the city to find Rayber, his uncle, and Mason's estranged nephew, a schoolteacher and rationalist who once escaped Mason's religious fanaticism. Rayber takes Francis in, hoping to save him with reason, logic, and modern thinking. He also raises his son Bishop with cold detachment. He loves the boy but can't express it. But Francis feels torn. Mason's voice, his prophetic fire, still echoes in his mind, urging him toward his divine calling. Meanwhile, Rayber's voice of reason tugs the other way. The two represent opposite poles. Faith versus rationality, spirit versus intellect. The tension builds until Francis takes Bishop out in a boat, ostensibly to go fishing, and in a moment that's both horrifying and symbolic, drowns him. Then, almost involuntarily, he baptizes him in the act. Afterward, Francis flees again, half mad and haunted. On the road, he's assaulted by a stranger, stripped, and left for dead. But even in that humiliation, he experiences a kind of spiritual awakening. At the end of the novel, he's walking toward the city like an Old Testament prophet, on fire with purpose, ready at last to fulfill the divine mission his uncle proclaimed. The title comes from Matthew 11:12. The kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent bear it away. It captures the idea that grace doesn't come gently, it's seized through struggle, pain, and resistance. O'Connor's story is about that violent grace breaking into the life of a stubborn, unwilling soul. Perfect. Let's expand the violent bear it away into a complete, rich overview with narrative flow and literary analysis, the way a teacher or discussion leader might unpack it for a thoughtful reader. Overview and setting. The story centers on Francis Marion Tarwater, a teenage boy raised in isolation by his great-uncle, Mason Tarwater, a self-styled backwoods prophet who believes God chooses him to spread his word, and that young Tarwater is called to follow in his footsteps. Mason's spiritual fervor is absolute. He even kidnaps Francis from the city as a baby to save him from being raised by Rayber, Mason's secular nephew and Francis's uncle. When Mason dies, Francis is torn between two legacies: the call of prophecy and faith, Mason's fiery religion; the call of reason and modernity, Rayber's cold rationalism. That conflict drives the entire novel, plot in expanded narrative form. At the novel's opening, Mason Tarwater has died at the breakfast table, leaving Francis with two tasks: to bury him properly and baptize young Bishop, Rayber's disabled son. But Francis, confused and resentful, doesn't do either right away. Instead, he's seduced by the whispering voice of the stranger, an internal presence that embodies temptation, doubt, and self-will, what some readers interpret as the devil, or at least the dark voice of pride. He burns down the house, is half drunk, and escapes to the city to find Rayber. Rayber welcomes Francis with wary pity. As a schoolteacher and atheist, Rayber sees religion as a sickness, something he escaped and now studies clinically. He wants to rescue Francis by teaching him rational thought, just as he wants to redeem his own childhood by properly raising Bishop. Yet Rayber's love for Bishop is painfully abstract. He feels affection but suppresses it because it makes him vulnerable. He fears that deep feelings lead to spiritual weakness. Meanwhile, Francis feels trapped between the two men's worlds, Mason's faith and Rayber's reason. He tries to resist his calling, but he can't shake Mason's voice echoing in his mind. The Lord chose you before you was born. The story's emotional and moral climax comes on the lake when Francis takes Bishop out in a boat. In a terrifying moment of both sin and revelation, Francis drowns Bishop, but in the same act he baptizes him, completing the divine task Mason had demanded. The act fuses murder and sacrament, a shocking portrayal of O'Connor's theme that God's grace can break through even the darkest human violence. Afterward, Francis flees in horror and confusion. On the road, a stranger offers him a ride, then drugs and assaults him. A final humiliation that strips away every layer of pride and rebellion. When Francis wakes, he's naked, wounded, and spiritually raw. But this time, he knows his calling is real. He sets out on foot, burning with prophetic conviction, to proclaim the word like the Old Testament seers before him. Themes and symbolism. 1. Grace through violence. The title verse, "The kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent bear it away," Matthew 11:12, expresses O'Connor's theology of grace. That divine truth often enters through conflict, not comfort. Francis doesn't choose grace, it seizes him. 2. Faith versus reason. Rayber's rationalism and Mason's fanaticism are two extremes, both forms of blindness. Francis's journey is a battle between sterile intellect and overpowering faith, with O'Connor suggesting that true redemption involves both suffering and surrender. 3. The voice of the stranger. This voice is one of the novel's haunting symbols. It's part temptation, part inner dialogue, the whisper of sin and self-reliance that distorts Francis's choices. It recalls the serpent's voice in Eden or the shadow self in psychology. 4. Water as double symbol. Water represents both destruction and salvation. Bishop's drowning is horrific, yet it's also the act that completes his baptism, the paradox of grace working through tragedy. 5. Prophecy and madness. O'Connor often explored the fine line between the prophet and the madman. Mason Tarwater's fiery visions seem deranged to the modern world, yet through them divine truth still flickers. Francis inherits that tension, the unbearable call of prophecy in a skeptical age. Her prose blends Southern realism with biblical grandeur. The dialogue crackles with rural idioms, but beneath every scene hums a deep spiritual intensity. O'Connor's characters are grotesque, warped by obsession or blindness, yet they reveal flashes of divine meaning. She once wrote that grace changes us and the change is painful. This novel is that idea made flesh. In the end, the violent bear. It Away isn't just about a boy or a prophet, it's about the human soul caught in a tug of war between God's call and the world's resistance. O'Connor refuses to give us an easy moral. She shows instead that redemption may come violently through fire, confusion, and loss. Francis Tarwater, walking toward his destiny at the end, isn't a hero in the usual sense. He's a vessel, cracked, burning, and chosen, carrying the unbearable weight of grace. Flannery O'Connor was a devout Catholic living in the Protestant Deep South, a setting she once called Christ-haunted. The people around her might not all be devout, but they couldn't escape the shadow of God's presence. That tension, the pull between belief and disbelief, runs through every one of her stories, and the violent "bear it away" is her most theologically dense. To O'Connor, grace wasn't something sentimental or gentle. It was a force, wild, invasive, and unstoppable. She believed that divine grace often comes through violence, disruption, or humiliation, because those are the moments when human pride finally breaks and the soul becomes open to God. Francis Tarwater's whole journey follows that arc. He resists God's call. He commits a terrible sin, murder, rebellion, flight. He's stripped, literally and spiritually, of every illusion of control. Only then does he receive the violent mercy of God. In Catholic theology, this echoes the idea of conversion through suffering, the belief that the path to grace often cuts through pain and paradox. O'Connor once said, "All human nature vigorously resists grace because grace changes us and the change is painful." That line could serve as the novel's thesis statement: faith as a mystery, not a comfort. O'Connor's Catholic faith taught her that God's ways are mysterious, not tidy. She pushes back against modern Christianity that wants everything to be sweet and reasonable. In her stories, faith isn't a cozy refuge. It's a wild, unsettling confrontation. That's why Mason Tarwater and Francis don't find God. He seizes them. They're reluctant prophets, caught up in a divine current they can't control. Even Rayber, the rationalist, feels the pull of that mystery. His tragedy is that he recognizes love as holy, but refuses to yield to it. In O'Connor's world, sin isn't just bad behavior, it's blindness. Both Mason and Rayber sin by misunderstanding God in opposite ways. Mason twists faith into fanaticism. Rayber reduces humanity to intellect. Francis stands between them. And through him, O'Connor shows that redemption doesn't come through correct theology or rational explanation, but through surrender. The drowning and baptism of Bishop, shocking as it is, becomes the novel's symbol of that paradox. The way divine purpose can burst through human sin, turning even tragedy into redemption. The title verse, "The violent bear it away," becomes a vision of grace as something seized rather than received passively. The violent are those who struggle, who tear away the veil of complacency to enter God's kingdom. In that sense, Francis's final march toward his calling, barefoot, beaten, and on fire with faith, mirrors the journey of a biblical prophet who's been broken and remade by God. Ultimately, O'Connor's theology makes The Violent Bear It Away a critique of modern secularism. She saw the 20th century South losing its sense of the sacred, trading mystery for psychology and grace for good manners. Through Francis, she reminds us of that God's presence still erupts into the world, not politely, but powerfully. O'Connor's characters may be grotesque, but her message is luminous. The divine is still at work, even in the ruins of disbelief. The Violent Bear It Away stands as the twin to O'Connor's first novel, Wise Blood, 1952. Both feature young men locked in a brutal struggle with faith, both haunted by prophets, preachers, and the inescapable pull of God. But while Wise Blood leans toward satire, its hero, Hazel Motes, tries to start a church without Christ. The Violent Bear It Away is heavier, more biblical, more tragic. It reads like a prophecy set to prose. Together, these works form a single arc, the human soul at war with grace. O'Connor saw the modern person as caught between belief and disbelief, not indifferent, but haunted. Her fiction confronts that haunting head on, showing that divine grace will find us whether we run toward it or away. Francis Tarwater's final walk, stripped of everything but faith, feels like the culmination of O'Connor's artistic and spiritual journey. He embodies her conviction that God's grace is relentless, that even through ignorance, violence, or madness, it presses toward revelation. In her letters and essays, O'Connor once wrote that she wanted to make belief believable for a generation numbed by skepticism. She didn't preach, she was shocked. Her grotesque characters and violent moments are lightning strikes meant to illuminate the outlines of eternity. So, when Francis walks down that road at the end, beaten but burning with purpose, he's not just one lost Southern boy. He's the figure O'Connor saw in all of us, bruised, bewildered, and still pursued by the fierce mercy of God.